County fairs had always been a family tradition for the Simmons. Even before Ella could walk, her mom would hoist her up onto her shoulders, weaving through crowds, sticky with the scent of kettle corn and rain-soaked hay. But this year, the air felt different. It was the first spring without her mom, and every sound in the fairground seemed muffled, like the world itself was holding its breath. The paths around the county auction tent were a churned mess of mud and trampled grass. People moved with umbrellas and old feed sacks over their boots, but Ella didn't mind the wet. The cold, squishy dirt seeped through her worn sneakers, grounding her to this place, this day, as she clutched the battered coffee tin close to her chest. She had counted the coins 100 times, each quarter and nickel pressed flat between her palms, each one a tiny hope. She kept to herself, her frame small and easy to overlook amid the bustle. Some folks at the fair knew her story. Most only whispered it. Since her mother's accident, Ella hadn't spoken a word, not to her father, not to her stepfather Russ, not even to her best friend Casey. It was like all the words she might say had been buried with her mother, leaving only silence in their place, but she still had the tin and a mission. Inside the big tent, the buzz was electric. Ranchers and breeders huddled near the front, hats low, eyes sharp. Behind a line of flimsy fencing, horses stood restless in their stalls, tails flicking, shoes clinking against the straw. Ella wove through the crowd, weaving between rubber boots and damp blue jeans, making her way to the farthest stall, where a tired brown gelding shifted his weight and watched the world with quiet, patient eyes. Whiskey. He wasn't the flashiest horse at the auction. In fact, his coat had faded with age, scarred in places from years of work. But Ella saw something in him no one else seemed to notice. His eyes, deep and dark, had once belonged to her mother. Not literally, of course, but in the way he looked at Ella. With understanding, with a patience that could outlast even the longest silence. He flicked an ear as she approached, nose stretching out through the rails, nostrils flaring to catch her scent. She pressed up against the fence, careful not to spill her tin of coins. For a long moment, neither moved. Around them, auctioneers shouted numbers. A baby wailed, rain hammered the canvas above. But for Ella, the world had narrowed down to the space between her and the brown gelding. Nothing, and no one else, existed. She reached out, small fingers shaking slightly, and ran her hand along the cool, rusted metal of the gate. Whiskey inched closer, lowering his head, the white blaze on his face, nearly brushing her knuckles. He paused there, breath warm on her skin, and Ella closed her eyes. She could almost hear her mother's voice. Easy now. He's listening. She hadn't spoken in 6 months, but he always listened. Anyway, to her stepfather, Russ, who called out from behind her, his voice tense. Ella, don't get too close. But she ignored him. Or maybe she just didn't hear. All she knew was that she needed to be here, needed to find a way to bring Whiskey home. He was more than just a horse. He was the last piece of her mother, the last link to the woman who had taught her how to ride, how to trust, how to be brave. As the minutes dragged, Ella watched people pass by Whiskey's stall without a second glance. Some kids pointed and laughed at his gray-flecked mane, calling him old-timer. Others, grown men with thick hands and hard eyes, whispered about his police past, about how he'd been retired early, no longer fit for work. But Ella saw more. She remembered the way he'd stood beside her mother's casket at the memorial, refusing to load into the trailer afterward, eyes lost and searching. She remembered the nights she'd snuck into the rescue barn, sitting in the straw with him, whispering secrets into his ear, words she couldn't say to anyone else. He'd always lower his head and press gently into her shoulder, grounding her when her world felt like it might spin out of control. Now, as the auctioneer's voice boomed through the tent, Ella's grip on the coffee tin tightened. She counted the coins in her mind, over and over, hoping, praying they'd be enough. In her heart, she made a silent promise. No matter what, I won't let them take you. Not again. Whiskey lifted his head, ears pricking forward, and met Ella's eyes. It was as if he understood everything she couldn't say. In that instant, She felt something stir inside her, a small, stubborn hope, fragile but fierce. All around the world moved in loud, chaotic bursts. But at the center of it all, a silent girl and a tired horse waited, each holding on to the memory of someone they loved, each searching for a way to be whole again. And though she hadn't spoken in half a year, standing there with her coffee tin and muddy shoes, Ella Simmons finally felt heard. Whiskey had always been a quiet horse, the kind who watched more than he acted, the kind who seemed to absorb the world's sadness and carry it in the deep pools of his eyes. But the day of Kate Simmons's funeral, Ella's mother, something inside him changed. People at the memorial whispered about it, but no one really understood, except maybe Ella herself. It was a gray afternoon when they laid Kate to rest, the cemetery ringed by bare oaks and the air thick with the scent of fresh earth. Whiskey had been led to the edge of the crowd, his bridle shining, hooves polished, mane brushed smooth for the first time since his last patrol. But when the service ended and Russ tried to lead him to the trailer, Whiskey simply refused. He planted his feet in the mud, neck arched, eyes locked on the casket, as if waiting for Kate to reappear. It took 3 grown men to finally coax him away, and even then, he never quite seemed to leave that day behind. In the weeks that followed, Ella visited the rescue barn whenever she could slip away. The barn was old, red paint peeling, boards warped with age, but inside it was warm and dry, filled with the low hum of horses shifting in their stalls. Whiskey always stood in the back, alone, his head hung low, but ears flicking the moment Ella stepped through the door. She made these visits after school, slipping past Russ, who spent most evenings buried in paperwork or lost in the flickering blue light of the TV. She brought carrots she'd swiped from the fridge, stale bread crusts, sometimes just herself, and every time, Whiskey would wait. He never nickered or stamped his feet. Instead, he'd lower his massive head until his nose was nearly level with her shoulder, inviting her into the silent, secret world they shared. Most people in Ella's life didn't know what to say to her anymore. Teachers gave her extra time on assignments. Friends tried to fill the silence with stories or games, but none of it helped. Ella's words felt trapped deep in her chest, as if speaking them out loud would mean admitting her mother was really gone. But with Whiskey, she found a kind of comfort that made speaking unnecessary. She would slip into a stall, careful to close the latch behind her, and sit cross-legged in the straw. Sometimes she just breathed in his scent, hay and sweat, and something earthy, familiar. Other times she'd let her fingers trace the white blaze running down his face. The only time her hands ever seemed steady anymore. Whiskey would lean into her touch, eyes soft. And in those moments, Ella felt something close to peace. One night, after a storm rattled the barn roof and rain pounded the tin, Ella pressed her forehead to Whiskey's cheek and whispered, so softly even she barely heard the words, "I miss her." The horse shifted, breath slow and steady, and for the first time since the funeral, Ella let herself cry. Not loud, not wild, just quiet tears that left salty streaks on Whiskey's coat. He stood unmoving, a patient sentinel, until her sobs faded and her breathing evened out. But the comfort of these secret visits couldn't last forever. Change was coming, and Ella knew it. The flyers went up around the neighborhood. Auction. All horses must go. Rescue funding had dried up, and every animal in the barn would soon be on the block, their futures uncertain. Russ tried to talk to Ella about it, but the conversations always ended in silence. He thought maybe a new start would help her move on. Maybe a different horse, a different place, a different everything. But Ella only shook her head, eyes down, clutching her coffee tin like a lifeline. On the morning the horses were due to be moved to the fairgrounds, Ella woke before dawn. The house was quiet, Russ's snores drifting down the hall. She dressed quickly, old jeans, her mother's flannel shirt, boots caked with last year's mud. She tucked her tin of coins into her backpack and snuck out the back door, the screen creaking just enough to make her pause, breath held, before she continued into the chilly, pre-dawn air. The rescue barn was already buzzing with activity, workers moving quickly, horses shifting nervously in their stalls. Ella slipped inside, keeping to the shadows. Whiskey stood in his usual spot, calm despite the rising tension. His stall door was marked with a bright red tag. Auction. Ella hated the way the word looked against his coat. She moved closer, running her hands over his mane, tracing the familiar line of white on his face. "I'm here," she whispered. And Whiskey's ears flicked back, catching her voice like a secret. For a moment it felt like they were the only two beings in the world. A sharp voice called out, a handler, clipboard in hand. "Time to load up, girl. Step aside." Ella hesitated, refusing to move. The man frowned, but before he could reach for her, Whiskey lifted his head and stepped protectively between them, his massive body a shield. The handler cursed, backing off. "Stubborn old gelding. He's more trouble than he's worth." But Ella knew better. Whiskey wasn't trouble. He was loyal. He was memory. He was hope, wrapped in a battered brown hide. She pressed her forehead to his and breathed deep, as if she could carry a piece of him with her when the time came. They loaded Whiskey last, a precaution against his stubbornness. Ella watched him go, heart in her throat. She promised herself she wouldn't let this be the end. The world might have taken her mother, but it wouldn't take Whiskey. Not if she could help it. As the trailer door closed with a dull, metallic thud, Ella pressed her hands to the cool metal and made another silent vow. "I'll find you again. I'll bring you home." The ghosts in the barn, the ones that haunted both horse and girl, seemed to stir, restless but hopeful. And in that quiet, dawn-lit space, something shifted. The first step had been taken. The story was only just beginning. The county fairgrounds were transformed on auction day. Tents flapped wildly in the gusty wind, ropes straining against metal poles while the scent of fried food mixed with the sour tang of wet earth and livestock. Even before sunrise, a line of battered pickup trucks had formed at the entrance, each carrying hopeful buyers, skeptical farmers, and the handful of regulars who never missed a spectacle. Ella's heart thumped nervously as Russ led her through the crowd, her coffee tin clutched tightly beneath her jacket. It wasn't just the regular fair crowd milling around today. Word had spread about the rescue horses, some with prize pedigrees, some with working backgrounds, all with stories, but only one horse mattered to Ella. And as she scanned the faces near Whiskey's temporary pen, she recognized the first real obstacle standing between her and her silent promise. Tanner Russ stood a full head above most of the crowd, his broad shoulders wrapped in a worn leather jacket, cowboy hat tilted low over a pair of coal blue eyes. He moved with an easy arrogance, all swagger and quick grins, like someone who knew exactly how much he was worth and what he could get away with. Tanner was the kind of man the fairground kids whispered about, the one who'd made a name for himself on the rodeo circuit, wrangling broncs and cash prizes with equal ferocity. But Ella's mother, Kate, had always said there was something rotten under the shine. Next to Tanner, a few other men, slick, laughing, rough around the edges, watched the horses with appraising eyes, jotting notes, making jokes Ella didn't understand, but felt instinctively to be mean-spirited. She saw the way Tanner looked at Whiskey, a cold calculation hidden beneath his smile. He nudged one of his buddies, nodded toward the gelding. "That one's got history," he said, "and a nose for trouble." Ella's blood ran cold. She remembered hushed conversations late at night, her mother's voice urgent but measured. She'd been investigating something about illegal drugs in the rodeo world, something Tanner's name had kept popping up in. Kate's death had left 1,000 loose threads, but this one seemed to tighten around Ella's chest as she watched Tanner reach out, as if measuring Whiskey's value, with nothing but a glance. But Tanner wasn't the only bidder, with eyes on Whiskey. At the far end of the tent, Wade Holloway waited, hands deep in his coat pockets, the brim of his hat shadowing a weathered, thoughtful face. Wade was the quiet sort, older, slower to smile, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. Ella had seen him a few times at the local market, helping his wife load bags of feed or leading a line of disabled children around his ranch's small corral. Wade ran a therapeutic riding center a few towns over, a place where kids with bruised spirits and battered bodies could learn to trust again, one hoofbeat at a time. Ella knew his ranch's reputation, gentle, patient, always in need of more horses who could offer comfort rather than competition. As Wade watched Whiskey, there was no greed in his gaze, only concern, and maybe the hint of an old grief that echoed her own. The tension in the tent grew heavier as people gathered, anticipation buzzing like static. Some recognized Tanner. Everyone in the circuit did. But not all remembered the story behind Ella's mother, nor the rumor that she'd been on the edge of exposing something big before she died. To them, today was just about horses and money. But for Ella and for Wade, the stakes were far higher. As the handlers prepared Whiskey for viewing, Wade stepped quietly to Ella's side. He crouched down, careful not to crowd her, and spoke in a low, gentle tone. "The gilding's special, isn't he said. Ella nodded, her grip tightening on her tin. Wade didn't press. Instead, he looked Whiskey up and down, studying the nervous flick of the horse's ear, the restless shift of his weight. "He's been trained for more than most folks know," Wade murmured. "You can see it in his eye?" Ella shot him a questioning glance. Wade smiled, not unkindly, and tapped the brim of his hat. "I worked with a few like him. Mounted patrol horses, narcotics detection. Those animals never forget what they're taught." The words buzzed in Ella's mind. She remembered her mother's old case notes, words like evidence, testimony, missing files. Had Whiskey seen something? Could he be a key? Tanner's shadow suddenly loomed over them. "You thinking of bidding on that old nag, Holloway?" Tanner sneered, flashing Wade a predatory smile. "He's got more mileage than a carnival truck." Wade shrugged, unbothered. "Sometimes the best ones come with a few extra stories." Tanner's gaze flicked to Ella, a chill running through his smile. "Pretty tin you got there, kid. Hope you're not planning to waste it." Ella shrank behind Wade's arm, but the older man stood his ground. "Everyone deserves a fair chance, Rusk," he said quietly. "Even the ones who don't look like much at first glance." Tanner's jaw tightened, his confidence slipping just a fraction. For a moment the two men locked eyes, an unspoken battle simmering between them. The crowd's attention shifted as an official called for the next round of horses. Ella, heart hammering, watched Whiskey pace the length of his pen. The brown gelding stopped suddenly, turning his head to look directly at her, eyes soft, alert, as if searching for a signal only she could give. Ella swallowed, forcing herself to breathe. Somewhere in the crowd, Russ was talking to another parent, unaware of the drama building around his stepdaughter. Near the entrance, Ella spotted a sheriff's deputy watching Tanner with wary eyes. The town hadn't forgotten everything, it seemed. Old wounds lingered, and not all of them belonged to horses. As the morning faded toward noon, a thin shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating Whiskey's stall. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Ella looked at Wade, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Don't give up, Ella," he said. "Not yet." She watched as Tanner drifted closer to the auction ring, arms folded, jaw set. Wade moved off to talk to the handlers, quiet but purposeful. Ella was left alone, the weight of her silence and her hope pressing in on every side. But as she caught Whiskey's gaze one last time, she saw not fear, but trust. A message clearer than any words she could have spoken. Enemies in the crowd, secrets tangled in the rain-soaked air, and a promise between a silent girl and a battered horse. The auction was about to begin, and Ella knew this was her moment to stand, no matter how strong the storm. The auction tent had always been a place of loud voices and quick deals, a temporary kingdom where money talked and dreams, good or bad, changed hands with the crack of a gavel. Today, the tension in the air was so thick you could almost taste it. A mix of old coffee, wet hay, and anticipation. People crowded onto benches or jostled for a better view. Muddy boots grinding sawdust into the floor. At the center, under a string of sagging bulbs, stood the auctioneer, a man whose job was to keep the process moving, no matter what heartstrings might get pulled along the way. The handlers began bringing out the rescue horses one by one, parading them past the buyers. Each animal had its own story, some worn into their coats, others hidden in the wary way they watched the crowd. But when it came time for Whiskey, the tent grew noticeably quieter, as if even the breeze paused outside to listen. Ella could feel her heartbeat in her ears. Her tin of coins felt impossibly small now, no heavier than hope itself. She stood with Russ behind her, his large hand on her shoulder, but she barely noticed. She only saw the way Whiskey stepped into the light, proud, a little tired, but dignified. The scars on his legs told of work and age, but the fire in his eyes was undimmed. "Next up, lot 23, the auctioneer called, voice echoing around the tent. "Retired patrol gelding, name of Whiskey, good manners, good mind, sound on his feet. Who'll start me off?" There was a moment's pause before the first bid rang out. Tanner Rusk's voice, sharp and confident. 500! His friends chuckled behind him, but the sound made Ella's stomach twist. She glanced toward Wade, who raised a hand almost casually. 600. The bids volleyed back and forth, each number a punch in the gut for Ella. Her coins, so carefully saved, could never keep up. The crowd watched the two men with growing interest, some whispering about the rivalry, others wondering what made this horse so special. Wade's face was calm but intent, never taking his eyes off Whiskey. Tanner grinned, his voice louder each time, determined to win through force of will as much as money. Ella felt the moment slipping away. She squeezed the tin so hard her fingers ached. All the words she hadn't spoken seemed to gather behind her teeth, pushing and pressing for a way out, but still she stayed silent, frozen, watching the price rise. 700, 8, 9, until Tanner barked, 1,000. The auctioneer glanced at Wade. 1,000 from Mr. Rusk. Do I have 11? Wade hesitated, his hand hovering, but he looked at Ella and then back to Whiskey, whose ears pinned nervously. 1,100, Wade said quietly. 1,100, repeated the auctioneer. Tanner hesitated just long enough for everyone to feel the tension. 1,200, he snapped. The crowd murmured. It was more than most folks thought the horse was worth. Even the handlers looked surprised. Ella's heart pounded so loudly she wondered if the others could hear it. Suddenly, as the auctioneer called for more bids, Ella stepped forward. Her sneakers slipped in the mud, but she kept going, chin high, coffee tin held out in both hands. The world seemed to stop. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the tent. The auctioneer blinked, thrown off script. "Young lady," she lifted the tin, rattling it gently. The sound of coins was small but clear, a note of honesty in a room full of posturing. For a second, she almost felt her mother's hand guiding her, steadying her trembling arms. Ella didn't say a word. She just opened the tin and held it up for the auctioneer to see. The man came off his platform, squatting in front of her. "Is this your bid, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Ella nodded, eyes wide and unwavering. A low chuckle rolled through the crowd, but it wasn't cruel, just surprised. Someone muttered, "That's Kate Simmons' girl." And suddenly, the attention wasn't just on Ella, but on her mother's memory as well. The auctioneer counted the coins, his hands moving with care. He looked at Ella, then at the bidders. "It's $74.50. There was an awkward silence. The rules were clear. Bids had to be in cash, in full and higher than the last. But the sight of the girl, alone and determined, seemed to weigh on everyone. Russ stepped forward, about to speak, but Ella shot him a look. A rare flare of defiance that stopped him cold. Whiskey shifted in his pen, ears pricked forward, eyes locked on Ella. He let out a low nicker, as if urging her not to give up. The tension rose as the auctioneer glanced at the crowd, unsure what to do. I wish I could, kiddo," he said softly. "But—" Before he could finish, Whiskey suddenly jerked against his handler's grip. The leather lead snapped taut, but the horse tossed his head, muscles bunching beneath his coat. The crowd gasped as Whiskey reared, hooves flashing above the straw. In one fluid motion, he broke free, spinning through the open gate, and charging straight toward Ella. Shouts rang out, people scrambling to get out of the way. Russ lunged forward, but Ella didn't move. Her eyes never left Whiskey. In that split second, all the memories rushed back. Her mother laughing in the saddle, the smell of leather and sweat, the promise she'd made to never let go. Whiskey skidded to a halt just inches from her, breathing hard, his chest heaving. He bent his great head and pressed his nose into her chest, almost knocking her backward. For the first time since the funeral, Ella felt her heart lift. The silence in the tent was absolute. Not a word, not a breath. Just a girl and her horse, locked in a moment so pure it felt sacred. The auctioneer stared, mouth open, as Wade stepped forward, voice ringing out over the stunned crowd. "He's already chosen," Wade said, his tone gentle but certain. Ella wrapped her arms around Whiskey's neck, tears streaming down her face. The coffee tin fell to the mud, coins spilling out like tiny pieces of hope. She didn't care. All that mattered was the warmth of Whiskey's body, the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. The spell broke as the crowd erupted in applause, soft, uncertain at first, then swelling as the story passed from lip to lip. Kate Simmons's girl, the silent child, had won back her mother's horse with nothing but a tin of coins and the truth in her eyes. The auctioneer stood, wiping his cheeks, and called for calm. "Let's take a break," he said, voice trembling. "We'll sort this out." Around Ella, people whispered, but this time the words were kind. For the first time in months, Ella felt seen, not as a ghost or a burden, but as a fighter, and in Whiskey's unwavering gaze, she found not just the memory of her mother, but the promise of a new beginning. For a moment after Whiskey's charge, the auction tent seemed suspended in a stunned hush. The world outside was all wind and drizzle, but inside, time had collapsed into a single breath. The handlers stood frozen, ropes dangling from their hands, unsure whether to lunge forward or simply let this living miracle unfold. People shifted on their benches and strained to see, each whisper weaving into the next, stories already beginning to form in their minds. The girl who hadn't spoken, the horse who wouldn't be parted from her, the way something invisible and powerful bound them together. Ella stayed locked in that embrace with Whiskey, her arms tight around his neck, her face pressed into the warmth of his mane. He stood like a statue, only his flanks moving as he breathed in the scent of rain, mud, and the familiar salt of Ella's tears. The coffee tin lay forgotten on the trampled ground, coins scattered in the mud like a trail of breadcrumbs leading back to every hope she'd clung to in the dark. Russ was the first to move. He called out sharply, "Ella?" and tried to step forward, but Whiskey's broad head blocked him. The horse's eyes were calm, almost serene, and Russ faltered, caught between anger and awe. Tanner Rusk was not so easily deterred. He stalked forward, boots slapping the wet straw, jaw clenched in frustration. "That horse is mine, by bid and by law," he barked, waving the auction slip in the air for everyone to see. "Move the girl! Get him out of here!" A few of his cronies started forward, but no one seemed eager to break the spell. The handlers hovered, exchanging looks. Caught between duty and the spectacle before them, the auctioneer raised his hands for quiet, but the tent remained noisy, half the crowd protesting, half just wanting to see what would happen next. It was Wade who finally stepped up, his voice gentle but firm enough to cut through the confusion. "Let's think about what's right here," he called out, staring straight at Tanner. "The rules are clear, but so is what everyone just saw. This isn't just about money or bids. That horse chose her." Tanner scoffed, eyes narrowed. "She had $70 in a coffee can. This is a business, not a fairy tale." But the crowd wasn't with him anymore. Old farmers and mothers with strollers, teenagers who'd never known a loss like Ella's, all seemed to draw a circle of protection around the girl and her horse. Some nodded at Wade's words. Others murmured things like, "Let him be," or "That's Kate Simmons's girl. She's got a right." Whiskey shifted his weight and snorted softly, his breath rising in the chill. He nudged Ella's cheek as if to comfort her. She looked up and for the first time since her mother's funeral, met the gaze of 100 strangers without flinching. No one expected her to speak, but her silence now felt like the strongest voice in the tent. One of the handlers, a middle-aged woman named Gloria who'd known Kate Simmons years ago, approached with cautious steps. She knelt by Ella's side, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, sweetheart," she whispered. "Nobody's going to take him from you, not today." But the tension wasn't gone. Tanner jabbed a finger at the auctioneer. "You have to honor the bid." "That's the law." The auctioneer looked torn. He mopped his brow, searching the faces around him. Folks, let's all take a breath. We're going to need the council to weigh in on this one. He paused, then said softly, "In the meantime, nobody's moving that horse or that girl until we're sure." For a few minutes, it seemed everyone was talking at once. Tanner threatening lawsuits, Wade calmly speaking with council members, Russ alternately pacing and wringing his hands, unsure whether to comfort Ella or argue with the officials. The sheriff's deputy approached, putting a hand on Tanner's shoulder and steering him gently but firmly back. In the chaos, Whiskey lowered his head and nosed Ella's pocket. She reached in and found the last of the carrots she'd hidden there, a ritual from happier times. He took it delicately, crunching the vegetable in slow, measured bites. The crowd watched, transfixed, as the bond between them played out in small, intimate gestures. Finally, the auctioneer announced a recess. We'll reconvene after lunch. Council needs time to review. In the meantime, let's clear the tent. All right, except for Ella and the handlers. People filed out reluctantly, some stopping to squeeze Ella's hand or murmur encouragement. Tanner stormed off, his glare promising that this was far from over. Once the crowd thinned, Wade found Russ standing to the side, a bundle of nerves and regret. "Let her have a moment," Wade said quietly. "Sometimes what's right isn't what's written down." Russ nodded, shoulders slumped. Inside the quiet tent, with only Gloria, the auctioneer, and a few handlers remaining, Ella finally loosened her grip on Whiskey. She leaned back against his broad chest and closed her eyes, feeling his breath stir her hair. For a while, nobody spoke. There was just the creak of the canvas overhead and the distant call of a blue jay in the trees. It was Gloria who broke the silence. "Your mom was a good woman, Ella. She'd be proud of you." Ella met her eyes, and just for a second the smallest smile flickered on her lips. She took Whiskey's lead rope, though it hung slack. The horse had no intention of leaving her side. As the day waned, word of what happened at the auction spread through the fairgrounds. Some said it was a miracle. Others called it fate. But everyone agreed on one thing. No amount of money could buy what had happened between Ella and Whiskey. The council would have to decide soon, but in that moment, under the canvas tent and the pale spring sun, the girl who hadn't spoken found herself at the center of a story bigger than any she could have imagined. And Whiskey, retired patrol gelding, once her mother's steadfast partner, stood beside her, not as property, not as prize, but as family. The world outside might still be full of storms, but in this small corner of the fairgrounds, Ella and her horse had already won something far more valuable than any auction could offer. The afternoon wore on, with sunlight dappling the muddy paths outside the auction tent, and the promise of a decision hanging in the air. Most of the crowd had dispersed, leaving behind only whispers and footprints, but inside, a quiet hush had settled. Ella sat on a bale of hay, her legs tucked beneath her, as Whiskey stood beside her, occasionally nudging her shoulder with his soft muzzle, as if to reassure her that, for now, everything was all right. Russ lingered at a distance, hands in the pockets of his heavy jacket, a pained look on his face. Since Kate's funeral, there had been a wall between him and Ella, a wall built of good intentions and words left unsaid. He'd told himself he was helping her heal by packing away reminders of her mother, including Whiskey. He'd pushed for fresh starts and moving on, never realizing the depth of what the old gelding meant to her. Now, watching Ella with Whiskey, guilt gnawed at him, sharp and unrelenting. The council's decision was delayed as legal questions surfaced. Could a minor even bid at an auction? Did the circumstances allow for exceptions? What precedent might this set? While the grown-ups debated and Tanner Rusk stomped around the fairgrounds, Ella remained with Whiskey, the two inseparable, as the world tried to make up its mind. Late in the afternoon, Wade Holloway returned. He walked quietly, not wanting to startle anyone, and approached Russ first, his eyes kind but direct. "Russ, I think you're a good man," he said. "But sometimes we forget that grief isn't about letting go. It's about holding on to the right things." Russ rubbed the back of his neck, jaw tight. I thought if I packed it all away, she'd hurt less. But I only made it worse. For both of us. He glanced at Ella, voice thick. She used to talk about that horse like he was part of her soul. Wade nodded. He was. Still is. He hesitated, then said, I've seen horses help kids in ways doctors can't explain. And I've seen what happens when you take that away, too. He looked meaningfully at Russ, who finally, painfully, nodded. With a gentle word, Wade moved toward Ella, giving her space, but letting her know he was near. You did something today? Most folks wouldn't have the courage to do, Ella, he said quietly. She looked up, the smallest spark of trust in her eyes. Then, in front of the remaining council members, handlers, and a few bystanders, Wade did something no one expected. He reached for the lead rope and pressed it into Ella's palm. No matter what the paperwork says, the bond's already made. If the council needs someone to sign, I'll step aside. He's yours. His voice carried the conviction of a man who knew the power of such gifts, not just the animal, but the act of trusting a child's heart above any adult's logic. For a heartbeat, the tent was silent. Ella stared at the rope, then at Wade. Whiskey nudged her again, as if to say, Go on. Slowly, her hand closed around the rope. Wade smiled and gave her a gentle pat on the shoulder. He picked you, and you picked him back. That's all that matters. Russ watched, torn between gratitude and shame. He remembered the day Kate had brought whiskey home for the first time, how the house had filled with laughter and the smell of horse sweat. He remembered arguing with her about priorities, money, time. Now, he saw what he had tried to bury, how much Ella had lost, how hard she was still fighting for the pieces that mattered. As Wade stepped back, Gloria, the handler who'd known Kate, came over with a halter and a faded blue lead. She handed them to Ella with a smile. You'll need these. He was always good for your mom, but I think he'll be even better for you. Ella took them, her fingers trembling, and fastened the halter over Whiskey's ears with practiced, gentle hands. The small group of adults watched as Ella and Whiskey walked together toward the edge of the tent. She didn't pull him. She didn't need to. He matched her steps perfectly, his body language open, ears turned back to catch her every breath. When she paused at the trailer, Whiskey stopped too, lowering his head so she could scratch the white blaze between his eyes. A few council members, moved by the sight, exchanged glances. The argument seemed to lose some of its heat. Russ stepped forward, still unsure of himself. Ella, he said softly. She turned, eyes wide and questioning. Russ hesitated, searching for the right words. I was wrong. About a lot of things. He swallowed, struggling to find his footing. I thought if we put the past away, maybe we could start over. But that's not what your mom would have wanted. She loved this horse. She loved you more. I'm sorry for not seeing that sooner. Ella met his gaze for a long moment. For the first time, the anger and sorrow in her eyes seemed to soften. She didn't speak, not yet, but she didn't look away either. It was enough for Russ, who nodded gratefully and stepped aside, letting Ella and Whiskey have their space. They walked to the trailer together, no rope needed. Whiskey followed Ella up the ramp and stood quietly while she closed the gate. It was a small thing, but for those who witnessed it, it felt monumental. The silent girl and the horse she wouldn't let go had, against the odds, found their way back to each other. As the day slipped toward evening, the auction tent emptied out, but the story lingered. People spoke in hushed tones about what they'd seen, a bond that outlasted grief, a child's determination stronger than law or custom. Even Tanner, for all his bluster, seemed diminished, his threats falling flat in the wake of something real and unyielding. Inside the trailer, Ella sat on the floor, her back pressed to Whiskey's side. She traced the white blaze on his face, the only time her hand was steady. He breathed out, warm and calm, and for the first time in months, the storm inside her seemed to ease, The world outside was still uncertain. The council had yet to make their final ruling. Tanner lurked somewhere in the fairgrounds, plotting his next move. But in the quiet space between girl and horse, there was peace. For Ella, who hadn't spoken since the day her mother died, and for Whiskey, who'd refused to leave her behind, the bond was unbreakable. The silent had become the strongest voice in the room. The following morning dawned cool and bright, with dew beating on the pasture grass and a hush lying over the Simmons house that felt almost reverent. Russ had barely slept. He found himself listening for Ella's footsteps, for the scrape of hooves outside, the little noises that meant the world was turning again. After the events at the auction, something in the family's rhythm had shifted. Awkward, uncertain, but full of possibility. Whiskey, now settled in the old barn out back, seemed transformed. Where once he'd paced, restless and wary, he now stood, calm, occasionally nickering, when Ella appeared. She came to him first thing, boots barely laced, hair unbrushed, face soft with the relief of finding him where she'd left him. Russ watched from the kitchen window, coffee cooling in his hand. He saw how Ella moved with the horse, the silent trust between them, and felt a pang of regret so strong he nearly doubled over. A knock on the door startled him from his thoughts. It was Wade Holloway, hat in hand, his pickup rumbling quietly in the drive. Wade was never a man to waste words. He greeted Russ and then asked gently, "May I see Ella?" Russ nodded, opening the door wide. "She's out in the barn. She won't mind company. At least, not yours." They found Ella standing beside Whiskey's stall, brushing his mane with quiet concentration. She glanced up when they entered, eyes cautious but curious. Wade smiled and stepped closer, careful to keep his movements slow and open. "He looks good," Wade said. "You take good care of him?" Ella nodded, and Wade leaned against the stall door, his face growing serious. "Ella, your mom was working on something before the accident." Wade's voice was gentle, but the words landed heavy. Ella's grip on the brush tightened. "She talked to me a few times about problems on the rodeo circuit. Drugs, cheating, things that put both riders and horses in danger." Russ tensed, but said nothing. He remembered late nights, Kate on the phone, shuffling papers, her brow furrowed in worry. Wade continued. "What most folks don't know is that Whiskey isn't just any retired patrol horse. He's got training, real training, for narcotics detection. That's why your mom brought him home. She wanted to keep him safe while she put her case together. She thought he might be the key to proving what was really going on." Ella listened, her face unreadable, but her hands moved with purpose as she brushed the blaze on Whiskey's face, as if drawing courage from the familiar motion. Wade glanced at Russ, who swallowed hard. I didn't know that," Russ admitted. "I thought—" He trailed off, the weight of missed chances hanging between them. "There's more," Wade said quietly. "Before the auction, I was looking through some of Kate's old files. She kept a notebook, a black leather one, full of names, dates, all kinds of things about Tanner Rusk and his crew. She told me once that if anything happened to her, I should make sure someone trustworthy found it." Ella's eyes widened slightly. She left Whiskey's side and slipped past Russ, heading toward the old tack room at the back of the barn. Wade and Russ followed, boots echoing on the wooden floor. The room was a mess. Boxes of gear, half-empty buckets, memories layered in dust and hay. Ella scanned the clutter, her breath coming faster. She moved to a shelf in the back, pulled aside a faded blanket, and reached into the shadows. There, in a chipped coffee can, much like the one she'd brought to the auction, Ella found what she was looking for. An envelope, yellowed and brittle, marked in her mother's looping script. She brought it to Wade with trembling hands. Wade opened the envelope carefully, revealing a thick sheaf of notes, news clippings, and a small, spiral-bound notebook. He flipped through the pages, reading Kate's meticulous handwriting. Observations, warnings, lists of horses tested for illegal drugs, times and dates of rodeos, where Tanner Rusk's name appeared again and again. "She was close to something," Wade said, his voice hushed. She might have even been ready to go to the sheriff, but, well, you know how this town is. Folks look the other way if it means keeping things quiet. Russ looked pale. All this time, I thought she was obsessed, chasing shadows. I told her to drop it. I didn't understand how serious it was. Ella pressed closer to Whiskey, who nudged her shoulder gently, as if reminding her that she wasn't alone. Wade looked at the child and the horse, and then at Russ. "We need to take this to the sheriff," he said. "But more than that, we need to make sure you and Ella are safe. Tanner won't take kindly to having all this come to light." Russ straightened, his jaw set. For the first time since the funeral, he sounded like a father again. "We'll do it right. For Kate. For Ella. For all the kids and horses who might get hurt if we don't." They spent the next hour reviewing the papers, building a timeline, assembling everything Kate had collected. Ella worked quietly but fiercely, handing Wade clippings, pointing out details, finding strength in the task. It was as if, for the first time in months, she felt her mother's presence, guiding her hands, whispering encouragement, helping her turn grief into resolve. By late afternoon, the evidence was in order. Wade made a call to the sheriff, who promised to come by that evening. Russ pulled Ella into a rough, awkward hug. "You did good, kiddo," he murmured, voice thick. "I should have listened sooner." Ella squeezed him back, not quite ready for words, but the gesture said enough. Outside the barn, the sun slipped lower, painting the fields gold. Whiskey stood at the door, his ears flicking as a gentle breeze rattled the branches. He watched as Ella, Wade, and Russ walked back toward the house, their steps slow but purposeful. In the fading light, Ella felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate hope of a girl clinging to memory, but the strong, steady kind that grows when the truth is finally given a voice. Tonight, she knew, would not be easy. There would be questions and hard choices. But with her mother's secrets finally in the open, with Russ by her side and Whiskey never far, Ella Simmons was ready to face whatever came next. Nightfall brought a restless hush over the Simmons home. The evidence that Kate had left behind, the notes, the notebook, the envelope, sat on the dining room table under a single lamp, its pages splayed out like a map of unfinished business. Ella hovered nearby, unable to sit, while Whiskey's steady breaths drifted in from the barn outside, a low rhythm that seemed to ground her heart. Russ stood at the window, watching the shadows stretch across the yard, feeling the weight of his failures heavier than ever. Since Kate's death, he'd moved through life like a man in a snowstorm, seeing nothing but gray, thinking if he just kept walking, maybe spring would come. He'd ignored her suspicions about the rodeo circuit, dismissed her warnings about Tanner Rusk, and worst of all, pushed Ella to forget instead of listen. Now, faced with the truth in his late wife's handwriting and the quiet strength in Ella's eyes, Russ knew he'd run out of excuses. The sheriff's truck pulled up, headlights washing over the porch. Wade greeted him first, offering a quick summary before ushering the lawman inside. Sheriff Dempsey was a broad-shouldered man, tired but trustworthy, and he took one look at the evidence before letting out a low whistle. "Your wife was onto something big, Russ," he said, flipping through the pages. "This is more than enough to open a case. I just wish we'd seen it sooner." Russ felt the familiar sting of regret. He turned away, rubbing his face. "She tried to tell me. I wouldn't hear it." The sheriff nodded sympathetically, but there was no time for wallowing. He took statements from Wade and Russ, then knelt to Ella's level, his voice gentle. "I know this is a lot, kiddo, but your mama did a brave thing. You're doing a brave thing, too?" Ella didn't answer, but she met his eyes without flinching. Sheriff Dempsey ruffled her hair, then set about gathering the evidence, promising updates as soon as he had them. With a nod to Russ, he left as quietly as he'd come, the red taillights fading into the night. The house felt emptier for a moment. Russ sat heavily at the table, staring at the wood grain. Across the room, Ella busied herself packing up the last of the papers, tucking them back into the envelope with care. She moved with a sense of purpose that made Russ ache with pride and sorrow. He knew he couldn't let the night end without saying something real. Drawing a shaky breath, Russ went out to the barn. Whiskey greeted him with a quiet snort, eyes patient in the gloom. Ella stood at the gelding's side, arms around his neck, her face half hidden in his mane. Russ hesitated in the doorway, his shadow stretching long across the straw. "Can I come in?" he asked, voice almost a whisper. Ella nodded, not letting go of Whiskey. He crossed the barn, boots crunching over hay, and sat on an overturned bucket. For a long minute, he simply watched the two, girl and horse, breathing in sync, their bond unspoken but undeniable. "I owe you both an apology," Russ said, finally. "More than one, I guess. I pushed you too hard, tried to make you forget things you weren't ready to let go of. I thought if I locked up the past, it would hurt less. But all I did was make you feel alone." He swallowed, struggling to keep his composure. "Your mom was the bravest person I ever knew. And you," his voice cracked, "you're just like her." Ella listened in silence, but something in her posture softened. Whiskey nuzzled Russ's arm, as if urging him to continue. "I know I can't make up for all of it overnight," Russ said, his eyes glistening, "but I want to do better. For you and for her." He dug into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "There's something I need to show you." He played back a recording, a shaky, muffled file captured when Tanner Rusk had stormed through the fairgrounds after losing Whiskey at the auction. In the recording, Tanner could be heard offering Russ hush money. "Keep that kid quiet, Simmons, and there's more where that came from." There was the threat behind his words, the sneer in his tone unmistakable. Russ's voice in the background, low and tense. "Get away from us, Tanner." Ella's eyes widened. She looked at Russ with new respect, and he nodded. "I thought you deserved to know. I kept this in case someone needed proof." Wade entered the barn just then, having overheard part of the conversation. He clapped Russ on the shoulder. "That's what doing right looks like," Wade said. "Your wife would have been proud." For the first time since the funeral, Russ smiled. Not a big one, but honest, raw. "I hope so." The three of them, Ella, Russ, and Wade, stood in a triangle of trust, the wounds of the past still visible, but healing. Whiskey seemed to sense the shift. He nudged Russ, warm breath tickling the man's palm, then turned to Ella, lowering his head until their foreheads nearly touched. In that quiet, the barn felt almost sacred, filled with the promise of forgiveness and second chances. Ella pressed her cheek against Whiskey's face, her eyes shining in the dim light. Russ reached over, his hand shaking, and rested it on Whiskey's neck. For a long time, the three just breathed together, the silence speaking more than words could. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, and somewhere far off, the fairgrounds lights flickered out for the night. Inside the barn, family, old and new, found a fragile peace. When Ella finally let go of Whiskey, she turned to Russ, meeting his gaze. She didn't say anything, but in her steady eyes, Russ saw the beginning of forgiveness. He hugged her, and for the first time, she hugged him back, without flinching. In that moment, with the world outside uncertain and the future unwritten, Ella realized she was no longer just holding on to the past. She was building something new, something her mother would have wanted. A life where love, trust, and honesty could grow, even in the places where sorrow had taken root. As the night deepened and the barn lights dimmed, Ella and Russ sat together with Whiskey between them, the air full of hope and the scent of hay. They didn't need to talk. The quiet was enough. The old wounds were not gone, but they had stopped bleeding. And for Ella, who still hadn't spoken a word since her mother's death, the comfort of being truly understood by her stepfather, by Wade, and by the horse who never needed words, was the first true step toward healing. The council meeting was called for a chilly Thursday evening, and by the time the sun dipped below the trees, the small town hall was packed to the rafters. The story of Ella and Whiskey had already rippled through the community. Some folks came out of curiosity, some to defend the rules, others because they remembered Kate Simmons and wanted to see her daughter get justice. The room buzzed with low voices as council members took their seats at the front, a row of solemn faces lit by fluorescent lights. The American flag hung above the dais, and beneath it sat the people who would decide if Ella could keep the horse her mother had loved, or if rules and rivalries would steal him away. Ella arrived with Russ and Wade. She wore her best jeans and a clean flannel shirt, her hair braided tightly down her back. She looked small but determined, clutching a folder with her mother's notes and the recording of Tanner Rusk's offer. Russ held himself stiff and tall beside her, protective in a way he hadn't managed for months. Wade's presence was quiet but reassuring, the kind of adult who made even the most intimidating room feel a little safer. Tanner Rusk was already there, leaning against the back wall, arms crossed, eyes hard. His friends filled the seats behind him, whispering and smirking. Even now, Tanner exuded a threat, a restless energy that put everyone on edge. But tonight, something in his swagger seemed brittle. Maybe he knew, deep down, that his grip on this town was slipping. The council chair, Mrs. Graves, banged the gavel. The room hushed. "We're here to discuss the outcome of the disputed auction," she announced. "There are claims of irregularities and exceptional circumstances." Her gaze swept the room, resting a moment on Ella. "We'll hear testimony before we decide." First up was Wade Holloway. He took the podium and spoke quietly, explaining Whiskey's background. His service as a mounted patrol horse, his narcotics training, his connection to Kate and Ella. He didn't dramatize or embellish. He just told the truth. "That gelding is more than just an animal to this family," Wade said. "He's a lifeline. I've run a therapeutic riding ranch for 15 years, and I know when a bond is more than sentimental, it's healing for both of them." The council members listened, some nodding, some taking notes. Next, Mrs. Delaney, Ella's counselor, stood. She told the room about Ella's silence since her mother's death, about the small steps toward recovery she'd made in the barn with Whiskey, how the horse had become a bridge back to hope. "Sometimes," Mrs. Delaney said, her voice breaking, "healing doesn't happen in an office. Sometimes it comes with hooves and a gentle nudge." When it was Russ's turn, he approached the podium with nerves, but surprising steadiness. "I'll admit I made mistakes," he began, voice rough. "I tried to push Ella forward when she needed to remember. I tried to put away the past instead of honoring it." He paused, eyes shining. "But I know now that losing Whiskey would break her in ways I can't fix. He's all she's got left of her mother, and I failed them both. But I'm asking for a chance to make it right." Then came the most dramatic moment of the night. Russ pulled out his phone and played the recording. Tanner's threat, his offer of hush money, the venom in his voice for all to hear. Gasps rippled through the audience. Tanner flushed but didn't back down. "You got nothing on me," he spat, but the room had already shifted. The council allowed Tanner to speak. He leaned into the microphone, dripping contempt. "I bid fair and square. This whole thing's a circus, just some kid playing for sympathy." He tried to smear Kate, tried to paint her as a troublemaker. But every word seemed to dig his hole deeper. Mrs. Graves cut him off. "That's enough, Mr. Rusk." As the testimonies ended, the room swelled with anxious silence. Mrs. Graves looked at her fellow council members. "We've heard enough," she said. "We'll retire to deliberate." While they disappeared behind closed doors, the hall became a storm of whispered arguments and encouragement. Strangers came up to Russ and Wade, patting their backs, murmuring that they hoped things would work out. Ella sat very still, eyes fixed on her hands in her lap, Whiskey's halter clasped tight between her fingers. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just waited, every muscle in her body taut with hope and fear. Wade sat beside her, his voice low. "No matter what they say in there, you did right by your mom, by Whiskey, by yourself." Russ knelt down to her level, searching her face. "Whatever happens, I'm not letting you go through this alone. That's a promise." It seemed an eternity before the doors opened and the council filed back in, faces grave. Mrs. Graves rapped the gavel. The room fell silent. This council has reviewed the evidence, the testimonies, and the circumstances. She began. The rules are there to protect both the animals and the community. But sometimes life gives us cases that the rulebook can't cover. She turned to Ella. Ella Simmons, we recognize the extraordinary bond between you and whiskey. We recognize the special circumstances that brought us here, and we recognize the wishes of your late mother, whose legacy of courage and care it lives on through you. Ella squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the halter even tighter. In light of all this, Mrs. Graves declared, the council unanimously grants you permanent custody of whiskey, with full support for him to be registered as your therapeutic partner. The town stands behind you. For a moment, the room was utterly still. Then applause burst out, gentle at first, then swelling, filling every corner of the hall. Russ gathered Ella in his arms, tears streaming down both their faces. Wade hugged them both. Even the toughest council members wiped at their eyes. Tanner and his crew slipped out the back, their power broken, their voices lost in the tide of approval for Ella and her horse. Ella, overwhelmed but radiant, allowed herself a small, trembling smile. She held the halter against her heart, whiskey's name tag gleaming in the fluorescent light. The words of her mother echoed in her mind. Be brave, baby. Speak your truth, even when it feels impossible. And in that moment, Ella felt as if Kate Simmons herself was right there with her, hand on her shoulder, whispering that everything was going to be all right. The gavel had fallen. The decision was made. And a silent girl with a battered old horse had changed not just her own fate, but the heart of her town. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a rare gift after weeks of rain and turmoil. Sunlight spilled through the windows of the Simmons house, filling every room with warmth, as if the world itself was celebrating Ella's victory. But inside, the real transformation was happening quietly, a slow, deep healing that had taken root the moment the council made their decision. Ella woke early, her heart thrumming with a mix of excitement and disbelief. It still didn't seem real, the way everything had changed so quickly. One moment she'd been a silent girl, clutching hope in a coffee tin. The next, she was whiskey's legal owner, his therapeutic partner, and, perhaps most important, her mother's legacy, now shining as bright as ever. She pressed her face to the window and watched whiskey, grazing contentedly in the sunlit paddock, the weight of fear finally lifted from his broad back. Russ was up before her, making pancakes in the kitchen and humming a song he hadn't sung since Kate was alive. The house felt different, lighter, less haunted, as if a stubborn shadow had finally let go. When Ella came in, Russ greeted her with a genuine smile and a stack of syrupy pancakes. Then nudged her toward the barn, whispering, "He's waiting for you." Ella didn't need to be told twice. She pulled on her boots and hurried out, breath fogging in the chilly morning air. Whiskey lifted his head at the sound of her footsteps, ears pricking forward, his eyes warm and welcoming. He nickered softly, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his mane, feeling tears, this time of happiness, sting her eyes. She led Whiskey out to the center of the yard, where Wade, Mrs. Delaney, and several neighbors had gathered to celebrate. Someone had made a sign that read, "Welcome home, Whiskey." It fluttered in the breeze, and Ella felt a flush of pride, not for herself, but for the journey they'd taken together, through grief, doubt, and the kind of love that refuses to be silenced. Russ joined them, carrying the official papers from the council, and handed them to Ella with a little bow. "It's all yours now," he said. "And so is he." Wade clapped him on the back, and even Mrs. Delaney wiped away a tear. In that golden light, something shifted inside Ella. For months, she'd kept her words locked away, certain that nothing she could say would ever fill the void her mother left behind. But now, surrounded by family, friends, and the horse who'd carried her pain as if it were his own, Ella felt a courage rising that she hadn't known she possessed. She turned to Whiskey, laying her forehead gently against his, and in a voice soft and trembling, she whispered, "You came back?" The words, her first in nearly a year, hung in the air, impossibly sweet and impossibly strong. Russ gasped, dropping the papers. Wade's eyes widened. Mrs. Delaney clapped her hands to her mouth, fighting back tears. For a heartbeat, everything and everyone seemed to pause, the world holding its breath in awe. Whiskey snorted, almost as if he understood the magic of the moment. Ella grinned, a real, dazzling grin, and looked up at Russ. "He came back?" she said again, voice growing steadier with each syllable. "And I'm not letting go." Cheers erupted from the small crowd. Russ scooped Ella up, hugging her tight, laughing and crying at the same time. Wade ruffled her hair. Even some of the tough ranchers in the crowd wiped their eyes, pretending it was just dust in the morning sun. The celebration flowed naturally into a day of sharing. Neighbors brought pies and stories. Mrs. Delaney organized games for the kids, and Wade led a few tentative rides on whiskey for some of the younger children from his ranch. Ella helped, guiding the children's hands, showing them how to move slowly, how to let the horses' calm seep into their bones. As the afternoon faded to evening, Ella and Whiskey found themselves alone in the paddock. She sat beside him in the grass, head resting against his shoulder, the quiet, a gentle companion. She closed her eyes, remembering the last time she'd spoken. The day of her mother's funeral. Words tangled up in grief and fear. It struck her that her silence had never been empty, just waiting for the right moment, the right reason to end. In the weeks that followed, the Simmons Ranch became a place of healing, not just for Ella, but for others too. Wade brought more children from his therapeutic riding program, kids who were scared or hurting or silent themselves. Ella worked with them, patient and gentle, never pushing for words, only offering the steady company of whiskey. And the lesson she'd learned, sometimes, the heart speaks loudest in the quiet. The community rallied, offering support for the ranch and the riding program. The town had changed too. Tanner Rusk's power was broken. His influence faded in the face of truth and justice. People remembered Kate Simmons not as a troublemaker, but as a hero. Her courage reflected in every stride her daughter and Whiskey took together. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Ella and Whiskey walked the fence line, the fields aglow with fireflies. Ella paused, her hand on Whiskey's warm neck, and turned to the imaginary audience that filled her mind, the other silent kids, the ones who felt alone or unheard. For the first time, she wanted to share what she'd learned, not just keep it safe inside. Not all healing comes with words. Some ride in on 4 legs and wait until we're ready to speak. If you believe in the quiet power of connection, in bonds stronger than words, share the story. Let's remind each other. Sometimes the heart speaks loudest when we listen in silence. Ella smiled, her heart full, her voice found. And as the fireflies danced around them, she knew she and Whiskey would carry her mother's spirit forward, one step, one whisper, one act of kindness at a time. If you enjoyed this story and believe in the magic of quiet connections, don't forget to like and follow our channel. There are always more stories waiting to be heard, and sometimes the bravest ones begin in silence.